They called them the Ghost Fleet. Submarines that could cross an ocean without refueling, strike from ranges that defied mathematics, and disappear into depths where sonar went blind. Yet by July 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force was a shadow of its former self, depleted by 3.5 years of brutal attrition warfare across the Pacific. Most of the veteran crews were gone. Most of the ingenious tactics had failed. The once proud 6th Fleet, Japan Submarine Command, had been reduced to desperate final missions, launching human torpedoes against impossible odds, knowing that surrender or annihilation approached with equal certainty. On paper, the threat was finished. American admirals dismissed Japanese submarines as operationally irrelevant in the war's closing weeks. Yet on the night of July 29, 1945, one submarine would accomplish what the entire Japanese submarine force had struggled to achieve throughout the war. It would sink a major American warship in a single devastating strike, triggering the worst naval disaster in United States history. The weapon was a Type 95 oxygen torpedo. The target was a heavy cruiser that had just delivered components for the atomic bomb. The attack would take 12 minutes from impact to sinking, and what followed would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The story begins not in 1945 but in the decades before the war, when Japan's naval strategists faced an impossible problem. In the early 1920s, as the victorious powers of World War I gathered to negotiate arms limitations, Japan's representatives understood they were being codified into permanent inferiority. The United States and Britain would be allowed 525,000 tons of capital ships each. Japan would be restricted to 315,000 tons, a ratio of 5 to 5 to 3. On paper, this seemed reasonable. Japan had fewer overseas territories to protect, and its defense perimeter was more compact. In practice, it meant Japan could never achieve naval parity with the United States, and any future conflict would be decided by industrial capacity and fleet size, both areas where America held overwhelming advantages. Japanese naval officers left Washington angry and determined to find asymmetric solutions. If they could not build more battleships, they would build better submarines. If they could not match American tonnage, they would outmaneuver American strategy. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had capped Japanese capital ship tonnage at 60% of American levels. Japan could never match the United States ship for ship in a conventional naval war. The solution, Japanese planners believed, lay beneath the surface. Submarines could operate independently across vast distances, ambush enemy fleets in transit, and whittle down American naval strength before the decisive surface engagement that Japanese doctrine envisioned. This was the core of the interceptive operation strategy: let the enemy come across the Pacific, then bleed them with submarines, aircraft, and destroyer attacks until the main fleet could deliver a knockout blow. It was an elegant theory. It demanded submarines capable of extraordinary range, speed, and striking power. The doctrine of interceptive operations evolved from this strategic reality. Japan's planners envisioned American forces sailing westward across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines, which American war plans designated as the forward base for confronting Japanese expansion. The American fleet would travel thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast, passing through waters where Japanese forces could attack. Submarines would strike first, sinking battleships and carriers as they crossed. Land-based bombers would attack during daylight. Destroyers armed with torpedoes would make night attacks. By the time the American fleet reached Japanese waters, it would be sufficiently weakened that the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet could engage and destroy it in a decisive surface action. This was the Mahanian dream adapted to Japan's circumstances, not to win by attrition, but to orchestrate a perfect storm of sequential attacks culminating in a single battle that would decide the war. The submarines were the opening movement in this symphony of destruction. Between 1920 and 1941, Japan invested heavily in submarine development. The resulting designs were among the most ambitious in the world. The I-class fleet submarines displaced over 2,000 tons surfaced, dwarfing their American counterparts. They carried deck guns, often 5.5-inch naval rifles capable of surface engagements. Some variants carried floatplanes in watertight hangars for reconnaissance hundreds of miles from the submarine itself. Range was staggering. The Type B submarines could travel 21,000 nautical miles at 16 knots surfaced, sufficient to cross the Pacific, operate along the American coast, and return to Japan without refueling. Submerged endurance was limited by battery capacity, but surfaced, these submarines were ocean-going cruisers in their own right. The design philosophy reflected Japan's strategic geography. Operating across the vastness of the Pacific required submarines that could sustain long patrols far from friendly bases. American submarines, operating closer to home waters initially, could afford shorter range. Japanese submarines had to be self-sufficient for months. The weapon that made these submarines truly dangerous was the Type 95 torpedo. Developed in the 1930s as a smaller version of the legendary Type 93 long-lance surface torpedo, the Type 95 was designed specifically for submarine use. It measured 21 inches in diameter and 23 feet in length, weighing 3,671 pounds with a 893-pound warhead. The propulsion system was revolutionary, a kerosene-oxygen wet heater engine. Unlike compressed air torpedoes, which left a visible wake of bubbles, the oxygen propulsion system produced minimal wake. The torpedo was nearly invisible as it ran. Speed and range were extraordinary. The Type 95 Mod 1 could reach 49 to 51 knots at 9,000 meters, or 45 to 47 knots at 12,000 meters. This was 3 times the effective range of the American Mark 14 torpedo at comparable speeds. In 1941, when the war began, the Type 95 was the fastest, longest-range submarine torpedo in the world. Its warhead was larger than any other submarine weapon in service. For Japanese submariners, it represented a decisive technological edge. Crew training reflected the weapon's importance. Submariners underwent rigorous selection that screened for technical aptitude, physical endurance, and psychological stability. The crews that emerged were among the Navy's best. They understood their boats intimately, could troubleshoot mechanical failures under pressure, and possessed the patience necessary for long patrols in hostile waters. Torpedo doctrine emphasized spread attacks, firing multiple torpedoes at calculated intervals to bracket the target, ensuring at least one hit even if the fire control solution was imperfect. The Type 95's long range allowed submariners to fire from positions where counterattack was difficult. Surface ships might not even know they were under attack until torpedoes struck. This was warfare as assassination, precise and lethal. Yet technology alone does not win wars. Doctrine determines how technology is used, and Japanese submarine doctrine contained a fatal flaw. The Imperial Japanese Navy viewed submarines primarily as fleet weapons, not commerce raiders. Their mission was to attack enemy warships, especially battleships and aircraft carriers. Merchantmen were secondary targets. This emphasis on warship attacks made strategic sense within the interceptive operations framework, where the goal was to weaken the American battle fleet before the climactic engagement. But it also meant Japanese submarines spent the war hunting heavily defended, high-speed warships instead of the vulnerable merchant convoys that sustained American logistics across the Pacific. American submarines, by contrast, focused relentlessly on Japanese merchant shipping, strangling Japan's economy and starving its island garrisons. By 1945, Japan's maritime supply lines had collapsed. American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of shipping. Japanese submarines, despite superior torpedoes and comparable crews, sank only about 1 million tons, mostly because they spent the war pursuing warships that were harder to find, harder to hit, and harder to sink. The men who crewed these submarines were professionals, trained in rigorous selection programs that emphasized technical competence and endurance. Submarine service was elite, selective, and demanding. Crews lived in cramped conditions for weeks or months. Breathing recycled air, eating preserved food, enduring heat and humidity in tropical waters, and knowing that depth charges or aerial attack could kill them in seconds. The casualty rate among Japanese submariners was catastrophic. Of 176 Japanese submarines that served in the Pacific War, 130 were lost, a 74% loss rate. Most went down with all hands. There were no second chances underwater. A single depth charge rupturing the pressure hull, a single torpedo finding the battery compartment, and the submarine became a steel coffin sinking into the abyss. Yet the men kept going out, patrol after patrol, because the Navy and the Emperor demanded it, and because they believed their sacrifice would matter. The pre-war years also saw Japan develop specialized submarine variants that revealed the Navy's ambitions. The I-400 class, designed in 1942, displaced 5,223 tons submerged, making them the largest submarines in the world until the 1960s. Each could carry 3 HEM-6A Siren floatplanes in a watertight hangar. The concept was extraordinary: submarines that could strike targets anywhere in the world, surface off an enemy coast, launch aircraft to bomb strategic installations, then submerge and escape before counterattack. Plans included attacks on the Panama Canal, on American West Coast cities, even on New York Harbor. The I-400 class represented Japan's asymmetric strategy taken to its logical extreme: if you cannot project conventional power, project unconventional power in ways the enemy cannot anticipate or defend against. Only 3 were completed before the war ended, and they never fulfilled their mission, but their existence testified to the creativity and desperation that shaped Japanese submarine development. In the first year of the war, Japanese submarines achieved notable successes. On September 15, 1942, the submarine IR-19 fired a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes at an American task force. 2 torpedoes struck the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, which sank within hours. Another torpedo hit the battleship USS North Carolina, causing severe damage. A 4th torpedo struck the destroyer USS O'Brien, which later sank from the damage. 1 submarine, 1 spread, 3 ships hit. It was the most successful submarine attack of the Pacific War, a vindication of Japanese torpedo technology and crew training. Yet such successes were rare. American anti-submarine tactics improved rapidly. Destroyer escorts equipped with sonar, radar, and Hedgehog mortars hunted submarines relentlessly. Aircraft patrolled shipping lanes with depth charges and homing torpedoes. The vastness of the Pacific, which had once been the submarine's ally, became a liability as American forces established bases across the theater, creating overlapping search zones that left fewer places to hide. The problem was not courage or competence but allocation. Japanese submarines were hunting warships that represented 10% of enemy tonnage while ignoring merchantmen that represented 90% of the logistical system. This was strategically irrational but doctrinally consistent. American submarines made the opposite choice, focusing on merchant shipping, and by 1944 had effectively strangled Japan's maritime economy. All tankers that once brought petroleum from the Dutch East Indies to Japan were sunk. Cargo ships carrying food, raw materials, ammunition were destroyed. Island garrisons starved. Factories shut down for lack of materials. The contrast was stark. American submarines, operating under a commerce warfare doctrine, had achieved strategic success. Japanese submarines, operating under a fleet warfare doctrine, had achieved tactical victories that did not matter. By 1944, the strategic situation had turned desperate. Japan was losing the war on every front. American forces advanced through the Central Pacific, seizing island after island, pushing inexorably toward the Japanese home islands. The submarine force, once envisioned as the steel edge of Japan's defensive strategy, was being ground down. Experienced crews were irreplaceable. Training new crews took time Japan no longer had. Submarines that sailed on patrol often did not return. Those that did return faced dwindling supplies, aging equipment, and shrinking operational areas as American forces tightened their grip. In this environment, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a final, fateful decision: it would deploy Kai-10, human-guided torpedoes. The Kai-10 was a modified Type 93 torpedo, 54 feet long, carrying 3,000 pounds of high explosive, with a small cockpit where a single pilot sat a day. The pilot would guide the weapon to the target and detonate on impact. It was a suicide weapon, born from desperation, and it represented the abandonment of the strategic vision that had once defined Japan's submarine doctrine. No longer were submarines precision instruments for fleet engagement. Now they were kamikaze delivery vehicles. The Kai-10 concept was born from a proposal by two junior officers, Sub-Lieutenants Hiroshi Kuroki and Sekio Nishina, who argued that conventional submarines were no longer effective and that pilots willing to die could achieve hits that conventional torpedoes could not. Their proposal was initially rejected as barbaric, but as losses mounted and desperation grew, the Navy reconsidered. The first Kai-10 attacks were launched in November 1944. Results were dismal. The weapons were difficult to control, operators had minimal training, and American anti-submarine defenses destroyed most Kai-10 before they reached their targets. Yet the attacks continued because the alternative, admitting that Japan had no effective counter to American naval dominance, was psychologically unbearable for the high command. The men who piloted Kai-10 were volunteers, often young, often idealistic, believing their deaths would matter. They were wrong, but they died believing otherwise. In May 1944, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto took command of I-58, a Type B-3 cruiser submarine newly completed at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The submarine displaced 2,140 tons surfaced, 3,688 tons submerged. She measured 108.7 meters long with a beam of 9.3 meters. Her diesel engines produced 4,700 horsepower, giving a surface speed of 17.75 knots. Submerged, electric motors provided 1,200 horsepower for 6.5 knots. Range was 21,000 nautical miles at 16 knots surfaced, sufficient for extended patrols across the Pacific. Armament included 6 533mm torpedo tubes, 23 torpedoes, one 140mm deck gun, and two 25mm anti-aircraft guns. She also carried a floatplane in a watertight hangar, though this would later be removed. Complement was 94 officers and men. Hashimoto was 36 years old, a career submariner who had commanded coastal patrol and training submarines earlier in the war. I-58 was his first major fleet submarine command. He understood that he was taking command in the war's final phase, when operational success meant survival more than victory. I-58's first operational mission came in December 1944, when she was assigned to the Congo Group, tasked with launching Kai-10 attacks on American fleet anchorages at Guam. The submarine embarked for Kai-10 and departed Kure on December 31. On January 12, 1945, I-58 reached a position 11 miles west of Ypres Harbor and launched all four Kai-10 between 3:10 and 3:27. The last Kai-10 detonated immediately after launching, killing its pilot before he cleared the submarine. Hashimoto observed two pillars of smoke at dawn and claimed to have sunk an escort carrier and a large oiler. In reality, the attack achieved nothing. No American ships were damaged. All four Kai-10 were lost. It was a pattern that would repeat throughout I-58's operational history. The Kai-10 attacks failed to inflict significant damage, and every weapon launched was effectively a crew member sacrificed for no strategic gain. Yet the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to deploy them, because admitting the Kai-10 program was a failure would mean admitting the war itself was lost. In March 1945, I-58 participated in Operation Tan No. 2, serving as a radio relay station for kamikaze bombers attacking Ulithi. In April, she attempted to attack American shipping near Okinawa but was driven off by intense anti-submarine patrols. The submarine spent more time evading attacks than conducting them. By mid-1945, American control of the sea was nearly absolute. Submarines could barely operate in contested waters. I-58 returned to Kure Naval Arsenal in May for a refit. Her aircraft catapult and hangar were removed, allowing her to carry 6 Kai-10 instead of 4. She was fitted with a snorkel, a German innovation that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged at periscope depth, reducing the need to surface and expose the submarine to air attack. On June 22, 1945, 162 B-29 Superfortresses bombed Kure. I-58 survived with several near misses. The base was burning. The war was closing in. On July 18, 1945, I-58 departed Kure on what would be her final war patrol. She was assigned to the Taman Group, tasked with launching Kai-10 attacks in an area east of the Philippines. Hashimoto commanded a crew that included 6 Kai-10 pilots, young men who had volunteered for suicide missions. The submarine carried 6 Type 95 torpedoes in addition to the Kai-10. The mission parameters were vague: patrol the designated area, attack targets of opportunity, launch Kai-10 if circumstances warranted. It was a forlorn hope mission, the kind issued to units when the High Command had no better ideas. The submarine headed south through the Philippine Sea, running submerged by day, surfaced at night to recharge. Batteries. American air patrols were omnipresent. Radar-equipped patrol aircraft forced I-58 to dive repeatedly. Hashimoto later recalled the tension of those weeks: every radar warning could be the last, every aircraft sighting a prelude to depth charges. On July 28, 1945, I-58 was 300 miles north of Palau when Hashimoto sighted a small convoy, the cargo ship SS Wild Hunter, escorted by the destroyer escort USS Albert T. Harris. Hashimoto launched 2 Kai-10. Wild Hunter's lookout spotted a periscope, opened fire with her 3-inch gun, and the periscope disappeared. Harris detected a submerged contact on sonar and conducted multiple depth charge and hedgehog attacks over the next several hours. The attacks were relentless, explosions shaking I-58's hull, light bulbs shattering, men holding onto pipes to stay upright as the submarine maneuvered at test depth. Hashimoto heard explosions and claimed 2 ships sunk. In reality, both American ships survived. The Kai-10 pilots were dead, their weapons either destroyed by depth charges or lost in the ocean. It was another failed attack, another pair of lives spent for nothing. But Hashimoto did not know this. He believed he had achieved success, and that belief kept him hunting. The psychological state of I-58's crew during that final patrol can only be imagined. They knew the war was lost. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo, when they could receive them, spoke in euphemisms about strategic adjustments and glorious resistance, but sailors who had seen their navy reduced to scrap knew the truth. The firebombing of Japanese cities was common knowledge. American forces were preparing for an invasion of the home islands. Submarines that left port might never return, not because they would be sunk, but because there would be no port to return to. Morale existed in a strange state, not the high morale of men confident in victory, but the grim morale of professionals doing their jobs because the alternative, mutiny, surrender, or collapse, was unthinkable. Hashimoto maintained discipline through routine, watch schedules, maintenance, drills. The crew functioned because functioning was all they knew. When I-58 launched Kai-10 on July 28 and believed them successful, it provided a brief moment of vindication. They were still relevant. They could still hurt the enemy. This belief sustained them as they continued the patrol. 10,000 miles away, on the other side of the Pacific, another ship was completing a mission of far greater consequence. USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser, had just delivered the components for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 8 days hence. Indianapolis was a veteran warship, commissioned in 1932, displacing 9,950 tons. She measured 610 feet 3 inches in length with a 66-foot beam. Her propulsion system consisted of 4 Parsons-geared turbines and 8 White Foster boilers producing 107,000 shaft horsepower, giving a design speed of 32.7 knots. Armament included 9 8-inch 55 caliber guns in 3 triple turrets, 8 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns, 24 40mm Bofors guns in 6 quad mounts, and 19 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Armor was modest for a heavy cruiser, 5 inches on the belt around. Magazines, 3.25 inches elsewhere, 2.5 inches on the deck. She was designed as a fleet flagship, with accommodations for a flag officer and staff. At the time of her sinking, her complement was 1,195 officers and men. Indianapolis had fought across the Pacific, participating in operations from the Aleutians to Okinawa. She had been Admiral Raymond Spruant's flagship during the Central Pacific Campaign. In March 1945, she had been struck by a kamikaze off Okinawa, causing severe damage that required months of repair at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. By July, she was operational again. Her mission to Tinian was classified at the highest level. She departed San Francisco on July 16, 1945, carrying a lead bucket containing uranium-235, the fissile core of Little Boy, along with other components too sensitive to risk on a transport aircraft. The mission was designated top secret. Indianapolis made a high-speed run across the Pacific, arriving at Tinian on July 26. The cargo was offloaded immediately. 10 days later, Little Boy would fall on Hiroshima. But the crew of Indianapolis would never learn this. Their ship had already been sunk. The crew of Indianapolis did not know what they had carried. They knew the cargo was important, Marine guards had stood watch over the crates, and the urgency of the high-speed transit suggested strategic significance, but the specifics were classified. Rumors circulated: secret weapons, chemical agents, gold for bribing Japanese officials. Nobody guessed atomic bomb. The concept itself was almost incomprehensible to men whose experience of warfare involved shells, torpedoes, and bombs filled with conventional explosives. The idea that a single weapon could destroy a city was science fiction. When Indianapolis departed Tinian, her crew believed they had completed a successful mission and were heading back to routine operations. The relief was palpable. The high-speed transit had been exhausting, and the Philippines meant rest, liberty, and perhaps an opportunity to hear news from home. The war was winding down. Everyone sensed it. The atomic bomb they had carried would accelerate that end, though they would not live to see it. After delivering the atomic bomb components, Indianapolis received orders to proceed to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training exercises before rejoining the fleet. She departed Guam on July 28, 1945, at 9 o'clock in the morning. The route took her southwest through the Philippine Sea, an area considered relatively secure. American forces controlled the air and surface, and Japanese naval activity was believed to be minimal. Indianapolis was not zigzagging, a defensive maneuver where a ship changed course at irregular intervals to complicate torpedo targeting. Zigzagging was standard procedure in contested waters, but the area was deemed safe. The cruiser maintained a steady course and speed of 12 knots, conserving fuel for the long transit. Her captain, Charles B. McVeigh III, was a career officer, the son of an admiral, experienced and competent. He had been given incomplete intelligence. Naval intelligence had reported Japanese submarine activity in the area, but the information never reached McVeigh. He proceeded unaware. The waters through which Indianapolis sailed were the same waters where, 3 years earlier, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been fighting for survival. In 1942, every transit was contested, every convoy escorted, every ship zigzagging constantly. By July 1945, the strategic picture had changed so dramatically that risk calculations had become complacent. American forces controlled the air from the Marianas to the Philippines. Japanese naval activity was minimal. Submarines were considered a diminished threat, more nuisance than danger. Intelligence had detected some submarine movement, but the reports were vague, the threat assessment low. Indianapolis proceeded alone, unescorted, because escorts were judged unnecessary. This was the hubris that attends dominance, the assumption that what has been true for months will remain true, that patterns of the recent past can be safely extrapolated into the immediate future. It was the same hubris that caused Pearl Harbor, though in reverse. The Japanese had assumed American forces would remain passive until attacked. The Americans in 1945 assumed Japanese forces were too weak to matter. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. On the night of July 29, 1945, IN-58 was 250 miles north of Palau, running on the surface to recharge batteries. The night was dark, overcast, with no moon. At 11 p.m. hours Japan Standard Time, the submarine surfaced. Hashimoto brought IN-58 to periscope depth first, scanning for aircraft and surface contacts, then surfaced fully once he was satisfied the area was clear. The submarine's diesels coughed to life, generators humming as they pushed current into the battery cells. The crew on the bridge gulped fresh air after hours submerged. The ocean was calm, visibility limited by haze. Hashimoto was preparing to head south when Lieutenant Tanaka, the navigation officer, spotted a ship approaching from the east. It was 2309. Hashimoto raised his binoculars. The silhouette was unmistakable, a large warship, possibly a battleship, making 12 knots, not zigzagging. Hashimoto's pulse quickened. This was the target he had been hunting for weeks. Hashimoto ordered an immediate dive. I-58 tilted forward, vents opening, ballast tanks flooding. The submarine slipped beneath the surface in under a minute, descending to periscope depth. Hashimoto pressed his face to the eyepiece, tracking the target. He misidentified the ship as an Idaho-class battleship, an understandable error given the darkness and limited observation time. In reality, the ship was USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser, but the distinction hardly mattered. It was a major American warship, exactly the kind of target Japanese submarine doctrine prioritized. Hashimoto calculated range, speed, bearing. The target was making 12 knots on a steady course, range decreasing. The approach geometry was nearly perfect. Hashimoto considered launching Kai-10, but the setup was so favorable he decided to use conventional torpedoes. He wanted certainty. Kai-10 attacks were unpredictable. Type 95 torpedoes, in the hands of a trained crew, were deadly. Hashimoto maneuvered I-58 into attack position. The submarine crept forward at 3 knots, electric motors whispering, periscope raised just enough for Hashimoto to maintain visual contact. The torpedo room crew stood by the tubes, ready to fire on command. Each Type 95 torpedo was preset for depth, speed, and gyroscope angle. The fire control solution was calculated manually, using observations of target bearing, range, and speed. It was a process Japanese submariners had drilled thousands of times. At 23:26, Hashimoto gave the order. 6 torpedoes fired in rapid succession, 2-second intervals between each. The submarine shuddered as compressed air ejected the weapons from the tubes. The torpedo's engines ignited, kerosene and oxygen mixing, propellers spinning up to 49 knots. 6 wakes, nearly invisible in the dark water, streaked toward Indianapolis. On Indianapolis, the crew was standing routine watch. Most men were below decks, sleeping in hammocks or berthing compartments, exhausted from the high-speed transit from Tinian. The bridge watch scanned the horizon, but visibility was poor. There was no sonar contact, no radar warning, no indication of danger. At 0:15 on July 30, 1945, 2 Type 95 torpedoes struck Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first hit forward, near the bow, detonating in the forward engine room. The explosion tore through bulkheads, ignited fuel oil, and sent a column of water and debris into the air. The bow began to rise as flooding pulled the stern down. The second torpedo struck amidships, near the bridge, penetrating the hull and detonating inside. The blast destroyed the forward fire room, severed electrical cables, and ruptured steam lines. Superheated steam filled compartments, scalding men alive. The ship lost all power immediately. Lights went out. Pumps stopped. Communications failed. Indianapolis listed to starboard, down by the bow, dead in the water. The physical dynamics of the torpedo impacts deserve examination, because they explain why Indianapolis sank so quickly. A Type 95 torpedo striking at 49 knots carries enormous kinetic energy. The 893-pound warhead consists of Type 97 explosive, a mixture more powerful than TNT. Upon detonation, the blast creates a gas bubble that expands at supersonic velocity, generating pressures measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. When this bubble forms against a ship's hull, it punches through steel plating, ruptures bulkheads, and sends a shockwave through the structure that snaps welds and fractures frames. The first torpedo hit forward, where Indianapolis's bow structure was less heavily armored. The blast tore open compartments below the waterline, allowing seawater to flood at a rate measured in tons per second. The bow began to sink immediately. The second torpedo struck amidships, targeting the machinery spaces where boilers and turbines generated power. This was deliberate targeting, either through calculation or luck. Destroying the engineering plant guaranteed the ship would lose propulsion, lighting, and pumps simultaneously, eliminating any chance of damage control. The attack was catastrophic. The forward momentum of the torpedoes, combined with their 893-pound warheads, punched through Indianapolis's armor as if it were paper. The kerosene-oxygen propulsion system delivered the energy necessary to penetrate the belt and detonate inside the hull, where the blast effect was maximized. Men near the explosions were killed instantly, vaporized or crushed by overpressure. Others were trapped below decks as compartments flooded. The watertight doors, designed to contain damage, became coffins for men who could not reach them in time. The ship began sinking by the bow. McVeigh and the bridge crew realized immediately that Indianapolis was doomed. The damage was too severe, the flooding too rapid, the power loss too complete. McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship, but with no electrical power, the order could not be broadcast. Men had to spread the word by shouting, running through passageways, pounding on bulkheads. Chaos spread faster than information. 12 minutes after the torpedoes struck, Indianapolis capsized and sank. The bow went under first, pulling the stern vertical. Men leapt from the tilting decks into the ocean. Others were sucked down by the vortex as the ship plunged beneath the surface. The final moments were surreal, the cruiser's propellers spinning slowly in the air, men clinging to the rails, and then the ship was gone, swallowed by the dark water. Of the 1,195 men aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship, killed by the explosions, trapped below decks, or dragged under by the suction. The remaining 890 men were now in the water, scattered across miles of open ocean, with few lifeboats and almost no survival equipment. The ship had sunk so quickly there had been no time to launch lifeboats properly or distribute life jackets systematically. Men clung to debris, to each other, to anything that floated. The water temperature was warm, around 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which delayed hypothermia but did nothing to alleviate thirst, exhaustion, or the injuries many men carried. Hashimoto, observing through the periscope, saw 2 explosions flash in the darkness. He saw the ship stop, list, and disappear. He decided to attack again, diving to 100 feet to open the range and reload torpedo tubes. The reload process took time, men manhandling torpedoes from storage racks into the tubes, setting depth and gyroscope angle, checking firing circuits. When IA-58 returned to periscope depth, the target was gone. Hashimoto surfaced and scanned the area with binoculars. He saw nothing. He assumed the ship had sunk, logged the attack as a battleship kill, and departed the area at full speed, heading north to evade any counterattack. He did not know he had just sunk USS Indianapolis. He did not know the ship had carried components for the atomic bomb. He did not know that the survivors, drifting in the ocean behind him, were about to endure one of the worst ordeals in naval history. When IA-58 departed the area, Hashimoto logged the attack as successful but did not know what he had hit. Japanese submarine communications with headquarters were sporadic by this point in the war. Radio transmissions risked direction finding by American forces, so submarines maintained radio silence except when absolutely necessary. Hashimoto would report his success when IA-58 returned to port. Until then, he continued the patrol, hunting for additional targets, unaware that he had just accomplished the single most successful Japanese submarine attack of 1945. The irony was profound. At the moment when Japan's submarine force was effectively finished as a strategic instrument, one submarine achieved the kind of success that the pre-war doctrine had envisioned as routine. The timing was meaningless. The war would not be affected. Yet for the men floating in the water behind IA-58, the timing was everything. Their personal catastrophes were unfolding independent of strategic considerations. War at the macro level is about nations and resources and doctrines. War at the micro level is about whether you can find something to float on and whether the sharks have noticed you yet. The Navy did not know Indianapolis had been sunk. The cruiser's distress signal, sent in the moments before power failed, was received by multiple stations but was not acted upon. One station assumed it was a Japanese deception. Another logged it but did not forward it to operational command. A third received a garbled transmission and could not confirm the ship's identity. The failure was systemic, no single officer or station was responsible, but the cumulative effect was that nobody realized Indianapolis was missing. She was not expected at Leyte for several days. Until she failed to arrive, her absence would not be noted. The survivors were on their own. The administrative failures that allowed Indianapolis to go missing without alarm are complex but comprehensible. The Navy in 1945 was managing thousands of ship movements across the Pacific Theater. Indianapolis was one cruiser among hundreds of vessels, and her absence from Leyte would not be noted until her scheduled arrival time passed. Routing orders had been issued but not tracked. The intelligence reports about Japanese submarines in the area existed but were not disseminated properly. The distress signals were received but not acted upon because each receiving station made independent judgments about the signal's authenticity and none felt responsible for escalating it. This was not malice or incompetence but the inevitable result of a system under strain, operating with imperfect information, making thousands of decisions daily. Most of those decisions were correct. A few were catastrophically wrong. Indianapolis fell through the cracks because systems are not infallible, and warfare places unbearable demands on systems. The men in the water were not betrayed by the Navy. They were failed by it, which is different. Betrayal requires intent. Failure requires only complexity and bad luck. The next 4 days were a descent into hell. The men floated in groups, clustering around debris for support. Some had life jackets. Many did not. The sun rose on July 30th, and with it came the brutal reality of exposure. The Pacific sun, unfiltered by clouds, scorched skin. Men without shirts suffered severe burns. Dehydration set in rapidly. Salt water surrounded them. Undrinkable, mocking their thirst. Men who drank seawater accelerated their own deaths, as hyponatremia poisoned their systems. Hallucinations followed. Men saw islands that did not exist, ships that never came, fresh water fountains rising from the ocean. They swam toward these mirages and drowned. Others, delirious, removed their life jackets and sank. The groups began to fragment as the weakest men drifted away, unable to keep up with the stronger swimmers who tried to hold the groups together. The human body can survive 3 to 5 days without water under ideal conditions. In the Pacific sun, with exertion from swimming and treading water, survival time drops to 2 to 3 days. The men of Indianapolis were pushing the limits of physiological endurance. Their kidneys were shutting down from dehydration. Their skin was blistering from sunburn and chemical burns from fuel oil. Their muscles were failing from exhaustion. Some men went quietly, closing their eyes and slipping beneath the surface. Others fought to the last, kicking and thrashing until their strength gave out. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. Men watched their friends die. They heard the screams of men being taken by sharks. They experienced hallucinations that felt more real than reality. The boundary between life and death became blurred. Some survivors later reported that they felt dead long before rescue came, that they had stopped caring whether they lived, that existence had been reduced to a mechanical process of breathing and floating with no conscious thought or hope. This was survival at its most primitive, not the heroic endurance celebrated in stories, but the grim, animal persistence of organisms that have not yet stopped functioning. And then the sharks came. Oceanic white-tip sharks, drawn by the vibrations and blood in the water, circled the groups. They attacked the isolated, the injured, the dying. Men screamed as sharks tore flesh from their legs, their torsos, dragging them under. The attacks were relentless, methodical. Survivors later described the sharks as patient, selective, taking men one at a time. Some men fought back, punching and kicking, and the sharks retreated temporarily, only to return. Others were too exhausted to resist. The sharks became part of the environment, as constant as the sun and the thirst and the waves. Some survivors later claimed that sharks killed hundreds of men. Others argued that more men died from dehydration, exhaustion, and drowning than from shark attacks. The truth lies somewhere in between. What is certain is that the presence of sharks added a psychological terror to the physical ordeal, a reminder that death could come at any moment from below. Oceanic white-tip sharks are open ocean predators, typically solitary, but they are known to converge on large food sources. The blood and vibrations from hundreds of injured men would have attracted them from miles away. Accounts vary on how aggressive the sharks were. Some survivors reported constant attacks. Others reported that sharks were present but mostly took men who were already dead or dying. The truth likely encompasses both experiences. Sharks are opportunistic. They prefer easy prey. A man thrashing and kicking presents more difficulty than a man drifting motionless. But a man too exhausted to resist becomes easy prey. The psychological impact of sharks was immeasurable. Men already traumatized by the sinking, already suffering from exposure and thirst, now had to contend with the knowledge that predators were circling below. Some survivors reported that they could see sharks passing beneath them, grey shapes in the blue water, and the sight paralyzed them with fear. Others became fatalistic, accepting that death might come from below and that there was nothing they could do to prevent it. By the third day, half the men were dead. The groups had shrunk. Leadership fragmented. Officers and enlisted men who had maintained discipline and hope in the first hours were now struggling to stay conscious. Fuel oil from Indianapolis's ruptured tanks coated the water, coating men's skin, burning their eyes, poisoning them when they inhaled it. The oil slick was visible from the air, a dark smear across the blue ocean, but no aircraft flew over. The survivors were drifting in an area considered secure. There was no reason for patrol aircraft to search there. The men waited, and died, and waited. Leadership among the survivors took various forms. Some officers maintained formal military structure, organizing men into groups, assigning watches, keeping morale up through discipline. Other groups coalesced around enlisted men with strong personalities or survival skills. Some groups fragmented as men drifted apart or died. The largest group, led by Commander Edward Pork, numbered over 300 men initially but dwindled steadily. Another group, led by Lieutenant Commander George Atterbury, was smaller but more cohesive. A third group, under Captain McVeigh, included many injured men and suffered higher casualties. The separation of groups was partly intentional, spreading out increased the chance that at least one group would be spotted by aircraft, and partly the result of currents and wind that pushed clusters of men in different directions. By the fourth day, communication between groups was impossible. Each cluster existed in isolation, unaware whether other survivors were still alive. On August 2, 1945, a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a routine anti-submarine patrol when he noticed the oil slick. Gwynn descended to investigate and saw something impossible: men in the water, hundreds of them, scattered across miles. He radioed the sighting immediately. A PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks, received the message and diverted to the location. Mark saw the men and made a decision that violated standing orders. He landed the flying boat in open ocean, knowing the swells could tear the aircraft apart, because he understood that men were dying and could not wait for surface ships. Marks pulled men from the water, cramming them into the PBY until it could no longer take off. He taxied among the survivors, distributing supplies, providing hope. Within hours, destroyer escorts and other ships arrived. The rescue operation continued through the night. By dawn on August 3, 316 men had been pulled from the water. Out of 1,195, only 316 survived. The rescue operation itself was a testament to improvisation and courage. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, piloting the PBY Catalina, understood that men were dying and that waiting for surface ships would cost lives. He made the decision to land in open ocean swells that could tear the flying boat's hull apart. The PBY was designed for calm water landings, not rough seas. Marks brought the aircraft down at considerable risk, and once on the water, the swells did cause damage to the hull, rendering the aircraft unable to take off again. But Marks and his crew pulled dozens of men from the water, cramming them into every available space, the fuselage, the wings, anywhere. The PBY became a floating sanctuary. Men clung to the wings, holding onto struts, too weak to pull themselves inside. Marks distributed water, food, and medical supplies. He radioed for additional help. The destroyer escorts USS Cecil J. Doyle, USS Bassett, and others arrived after dark and began pulling men from the water using searchlights, cargo nets, and sheer determination. The rescue continued through the night, ships maneuvering among groups of survivors, crews leaning over the rails to grab men too weak to climb. By dawn on August 3, all living survivors had been recovered. The final count was 316 men. Out of 1,195, only 316. The mathematics of that ratio haunted everyone involved. The aftermath was bitter and complex. Captain McVeigh was court-martialed for failing to zigzag and for not ordering abandoned ship in time. He was convicted, the only U.S. Navy captain court-martialed for losing a ship to enemy action in World War II. The verdict was controversial. Many survivors defended McVeigh, arguing that the Navy's intelligence failure and the lack of escort were the real culprits. Hashimoto was brought to testify at the court-martial, an extraordinary decision that placed the enemy submarine commander in the position of providing evidence. Hashimoto testified that zigzagging would not have saved Indianapolis, that the attack geometry was such that he would have hit her regardless. The court disregarded his testimony and convicted McVeigh anyway. McVeigh continued to serve in the Navy but never escaped the shadow of Indianapolis. In 1968, he took his own life. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating him, recognizing that his conviction had been unjust. Hashimoto's testimony at McVeigh's court-martial was extraordinary for multiple reasons. First, it was unprecedented to bring an enemy combatant to testify in an American military trial. Second, Hashimoto's testimony actually supported McVeigh, stating that zigzagging would not have prevented the attack. Hashimoto explained that the attack geometry had been so favorable, and the Type 95 torpedoes so effective, that evasive maneuvers would only have delayed the inevitable. The court-martial board ignored this testimony, perhaps because acknowledging it would implicate the Navy's systemic failures rather than individual culpability. McVeigh was a convenient scapegoat, a captain who could be held responsible so that admirals and staff officers would not have to answer for intelligence failures, routing decisions, and communication breakdowns. The injustice of McVeigh's conviction was recognized even at the time. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, recommended clemency. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal remitted McVeigh's sentence. But the conviction remained on his record, and the stigma followed him. Survivors of Indianapolis split on McVeigh's guilt. Some defended him fiercely. Others blamed him for not zigzagging or for not getting the word out faster to abandon ship. The truth, as always, was more complex than any single narrative could capture. I-58 returned to Kure on August 18, 1945. 6 days earlier, Japan had announced its intention to surrender. The war was over. Hashimoto and his crew had survived, one of the few Japanese submarines to do so. I-58 was decommissioned and in April 1946 was towed to sea and scuttled by the U.S. Navy as part of Operation Road's End, which disposed of Japanese submarines to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. In 2017, sonar located the wreck of I-58 on the seafloor 200 meters deep, standing vertically, encrusted with marine life. The submarine had been positively identified by its rudder. Hashimoto lived until 2000, outliving most of the men he had sent to their deaths. He expressed regret for the suffering of Indianapolis's crew but maintained that he had been following orders, doing his duty as a naval officer. His testimony at McVeigh's court-martial had been an act of honor, an acknowledgement that the American captain had not been responsible for the disaster. The sinking of Indianapolis was the culmination of two trajectories. On one side was a submarine force that had begun the war with technological superiority and strategic ambition but had been ground down by attrition, misused by doctrine, and reduced to desperation tactics. On the other side was a navy that dominated the Pacific, controlled the sea and air, and had grown complacent in its supremacy. The collision of these trajectories, on a dark night in July 1945, resulted in the deaths of 879 men. It was the last major ship the United States would lose in World War II. It was also one of the last significant actions by a Japanese submarine. The weapon that had once been envisioned as the cutting edge of Japan's naval strategy had ended the war with a single, devastating success, and then vanished into history. The technology that had enabled I-58's success, the Type 95 torpedo, the oxygen propulsion system, the fire control procedures, represented 2 decades of Japanese engineering refinement. After the war, American and Soviet engineers examined the technology closely. The Soviet Union was particularly interested in oxygen torpedoes, as they fit Soviet submarine doctrine, which emphasized long-range strikes. The Soviet Type 65 torpedo, introduced in the 1960s, used oxygen enrichment and shared design principles with the Type 95. The lineage was clear. Japanese innovations from the 1930s influenced Cold War weapons systems, testament to the enduring value of good engineering. The Type 95's legacy was not just the ships it sank but the technological pathways it opened. This is how warfare evolves. Successful weapons are studied, copied, improved. The Type 95 was successful enough to warrant study, even if the strategic context that produced it had failed. The legacy of this event is layered. For the United States Navy, Indianapolis became a case study in communication failures, intelligence lapses, and the consequences of assuming control over an environment that remains inherently hostile. The ocean does not respect dominance. It kills with indifference. For Japan, the sinking was a final reminder that technological excellence and individual courage could not compensate for strategic failure. The submarine force had sunk only a fraction of the tonnage American submarines had destroyed because it had pursued the wrong targets with the wrong doctrine. For the men who survived, Indianapolis became a defining ordeal, a trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Many refused to speak about it for decades. Others spoke of it constantly, unable to escape the memory of the water, the sun, the sharks, the silence of men who stopped struggling and sank. The irony is profound. Indianapolis had just delivered the weapon that would end the war. Little Boy, the atomic bomb, was the product of 3 years of scientific effort, billions of dollars, and the mobilization of America's industrial capacity. It represented modernity, technology, the apex of human destructive capability. Yet the ship that carried it was sunk by a torpedo designed in the 1930s, fired from a submarine that was obsolete by 1945 standards, commanded by a man who was simply doing his job in a war that was already lost. The atomic bomb would kill tens of thousands in Hiroshima. The sinking of Indianapolis would kill 879. One event is remembered as a turning point in history. The other is remembered as a tragedy. Both were acts of war, both were consequences of decisions made by men far from the violence, and both left scars that have not healed. The sinking also revealed the limits of strategic intelligence. American code-breaking had been extraordinarily successful throughout the Pacific War. The ability to read Japanese communications had contributed to victories at Midway, the Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. Yet in July 1945, intelligence failed to detect I-58's patrol or warn Indianapolis of the threat. This was partly because Japanese submarine communications were sporadic and heavily encrypted, partly because I-58 maintained radio silence for most of the patrol, and partly because intelligence resources were focused elsewhere, on the coming invasion of Japan, on atomic bomb preparations, on the Soviet entry into the war. Indianapolis was one ship on a routine transit through waters considered secure. The intelligence failure was not a breakdown but a matter of priorities. Every intelligence system has limited resources and must allocate them. Indianapolis fell outside the prioritization, and the result was 879 dead. This is the tragedy of complex systems. They optimize for general cases and fail on edge cases. Indianapolis was an edge case. The ocean keeps its secrets. The wreck of Indianapolis was discovered in 2017 by a search team funded by Paul Allen, lying 18,000 feet below the surface in the Philippine Sea. Photographs show the ship's structure remarkably preserved, the turret still in place, the hull split but recognizable. It is a war grave, protected under international law. The wreck of I-58 was found the same year, also preserved, also a grave. The two ships rest in the darkness, thousands of miles apart, monuments to a war that killed millions and to a technology that promised precision but delivered chaos. The men who died on both ships were following orders, serving their countries, believing in causes they had been told were just. Their deaths accomplished nothing that could not have been accomplished without them. This is the nature of war. The physical remains of both ships lie in darkness that has never been disturbed by sunlight. At 18,000 feet depth for Indianapolis and 200 meters for IE-58, pressure is measured in tons per square inch. The wrecks are cold, near freezing, despite the tropical surface waters above. Microorganisms and deep-water scavengers have colonized the steel, breaking it down molecule by molecule. The ships are being consumed by the ocean, slowly, inexorably, until eventually nothing recognizable will remain. This process will take centuries, perhaps millennia, but it is inevitable. The ocean reclaims everything. Future generations may visit these sites with submersibles, may document the decay, may try to extract artifacts or data, but the ships themselves will never return to the surface. They are graves, and graves should not be disturbed. International law recognizes this, designating sunken warships as sovereign territory of their flag nations and prohibiting unauthorized salvage. The wrecks of Indianapolis and IE-58 are protected sites, memorials to the men who went down with them. The survivors of Indianapolis went home to a world that struggled to understand what they had endured. Some received medals. Others received silence. Many married, had children, built lives that looked normal from the outside. But the ocean never left them. They carried it in their dreams, in their reflexes, in the way they flinched at loud noises or avoided swimming in deep water. Some became advocates, speaking at schools and museums, ensuring that the story would not be forgotten. Others withdrew, unable to relive the memories even for historical preservation. A few, like Captain McVeigh, could not reconcile what had happened with how they were treated afterward, and chose to leave on their own terms. The Indianapolis Survivors Organization, formed in the years after the war, became a community of men who had shared an experience so extreme that outsiders could never fully understand it. They met annually, fewer each year, until the last of them were gone. In 2025, as of this writing, there are no known survivors. Medical science later studied the Indianapolis survivors to understand human limits under extreme stress. The physiological data was grimly instructive. Men who survived 4 to 5 days in the water without fresh water had experienced kidney damage, liver dysfunction, cardiovascular strain. Some suffered permanent neurological damage from dehydration and heat exposure. The psychological trauma manifested in nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety disorders that would not be formally diagnosed as PTSD for another 3 decades. Doctors treating Indianapolis survivors in 1945 lacked the framework to understand what they were seeing. The men were physically recovering but psychologically broken. Some were violent, lashing out at medical staff. Others were catatonic, unresponsive. Most fell somewhere between, functional but damaged. The Navy provided medical care but little psychological support, because the concept of combat trauma treatment was in its infancy. Men were expected to recover through willpower and time. Some did. Many did not. The invisible wounds would shape their lives as profoundly as the visible scars. The Type 95 torpedo, the weapon that sank Indianapolis, was one of the most successful torpedo designs of World War II. It remained in service with the Japanese Navy until 1945, outlasting many of its contemporaries. After the war, the United States and the Soviet Union both examined captured Type 95 torpedoes, seeking to understand the oxygen propulsion system that had given Japan such an advantage. The technology influenced post-war torpedo development, particularly in the Soviet Union, which developed oxygen torpedoes for its submarine fleet during the Cold War. The Type 95's legacy is not just the ships it sank, but the design principles it validated. Speed, range, and stealth were more valuable than raw explosive power. This lesson, learned at great cost in the Pacific, shaped underwater warfare for decades. The sinking of Indianapolis also exposed the limits of operational security. The ship's mission to Tinian was so secret that even after she sank, nobody realized she was missing. Security protocols designed to protect sensitive information had the unintended consequence of isolating the ship from the systems that might have saved her crew. This paradox, where security becomes a vulnerability, has recurred throughout military history. The balance between operational secrecy and situational awareness is delicate. Indianapolis fell through the gap. The Navy learned from this, implementing changes to reporting protocols and communication systems to ensure that no ship could disappear again without immediate notice. Yet even these changes could not eliminate the fundamental risks of naval warfare. Ships still sink. Men still drown. The ocean still does not care. The doctrinal lessons were absorbed into naval warfare training. Zigzagging procedures were revised and mandated even in supposedly secure waters. Communication protocols were overhauled to ensure no ship could disappear without triggering immediate alerts. Intelligence dissemination was improved so that commanders received threat assessments relevant to their specific routes. Anti-submarine warfare tactics continued to evolve, incorporating technologies that had been experimental in 1945. Sonar improved in range and accuracy. Helicopters equipped with dipping sonar and homing torpedoes added a new dimension to submarine hunting. Nuclear submarines, which could remain submerged indefinitely, changed the strategic calculus entirely, rendering many lessons from the diesel-electric submarine era obsolete. Yet the fundamental truth remained: submarines are ambush predators, most dangerous when they go undetected, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage in seconds. No amount of technological advancement has eliminated this vulnerability. Surface ships are still vulnerable to submarines. The Indianapolis disaster was a reminder that will never become irrelevant as long as navies operate on the ocean. What remains is the question of meaning. What did the sinking of Indianapolis mean in the context of the war? Strategically, it meant nothing. By July 1945, Japan was defeated. The atomic bombs were coming. Surrender was inevitable. Sinking one cruiser, however tragic, did not alter the outcome. Tactically, it meant that Japanese submarines, even at the war's end, remained a threat if given the opportunity. American complacency, born from months of dominance, had created that opportunity. Psychologically, it meant that war's cruelty does not diminish as victory approaches. The men who died on Indianapolis were as dead as those who died at Pearl Harbor, and their deaths were no less random, no less brutal. The war did not spare them because it was nearly over. If anything, their deaths seem more wasteful because they came so late, so close to peace. For historians, Indianapolis is a reminder that narratives of inevitable victory obscure the chaos and contingency of war. The United States won the Pacific War, but individual battles, individual ships, individual men could still be lost. Victory at the macro level does not prevent tragedy at the micro level. The submarines that the American admirals dismissed as irrelevant could still kill. The torpedoes developed in the 1930s could still sink ships in 1945. The ocean, indifferent to politics and strategy, could still claim lives. This is not a comfortable lesson. It does not fit neatly into triumphalist histories. But it is the truth that the survivors of Indianapolis lived with, and it is the truth that the wreckage on the ocean floor testifies to. The historical memory of Indianapolis evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, the story was suppressed, partly to avoid demoralizing a weary public, partly to avoid embarrassing questions about why the Navy had allowed a major warship to go missing. As veterans returned home and began talking, the story leaked out in fragments. By the 1960s, Indianapolis had become a footnote in Pacific War histories, mentioned briefly alongside other ship losses. In 1975, the publication of Richard F. Newcomb's Abandoned Ship brought detailed attention to the disaster. In 1991, Dan Kurzman's Fatal Voyage provided additional documentation. In 2001, Doug Stanton's In Harm's Way reached a wider audience and renewed public interest. A 2016 film, USS Indianapolis, Men of Courage, starring Nicolas Cage, brought the story to mainstream awareness, though historical accuracy was sacrificed for dramatic effect. Each retelling shaped public understanding, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. The survivors themselves became custodians of the story, speaking at schools and museums, correcting misconceptions, ensuring that the men who died would not be forgotten. When the last survivors passed, the story transitioned from living memory to historical record, a transition that every event eventually undergoes. 80 years have passed since that night in July 1945. The men are gone. The ships are rust and coral. The ocean has reclaimed what was once steel and flesh. Yet the story endures, because it contains something essential about human experience under extreme conditions. It is a story of technology and doctrine, of strategy and failure, of courage and suffering, of bureaucracy and consequences. It is a story where the machines worked exactly as designed, the men followed orders, and the result was catastrophe. It is a story that resists easy conclusions, because the truths it reveals are uncomfortable, that competence does not guarantee survival, that victory does not prevent tragedy, that the line between duty and disaster is thinner than we like to believe. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.